Hello and welcome back to Relentless Learning. It's been a little bit of time, so I appreciate your patience. If you are new to the channel, welcome. If you're not, that last video got a lot of heat. There were definitely a lot of Peterson fans. I guess it's to be expected. There were also a lot of people that I would probably say are self-identifying as conservative or right-leaning. At the very least, insofar as that there was a lot of hate towards the broadly, let's call it left-leaning folk. There were some misconceptions in terms of what I was trying to get across versus what I read in the comments, but that's all right. The point is, I actually went down a little racism, critical race theory rabbit hole, and I found that at least in terms of YouTube, there's a lot of people that seem to be anti-racist, if you get what I mean. So I decided I want to get a little bit deeper with some of the topics, specifically starting off with anti-racism, then moving to CRT. I'm going to be presenting hopefully a less radical viewpoint than maybe what you've come across in media or other people you've come across. Definitely not going to be a kind of indoctrination mindset. In terms of goals for this anti-racism series, first, I actually have to start by defining what racism is. We can't talk about anti-racism unless we know what racism is. Now, you might be thinking, well, obviously that's treating people differently based on your skin color. Yes and no. There's different levels of racism, and when people unintentionally use different working definitions of the word, it more often than not leads to misunderstanding, right? Second, once we know or have a better idea of what racism is, that's when we can start talking about anti-racism. I'm lightly going to be touching on some of the things that Christopher Rufo and James Lindsay in particular have critiqued. A lot of the times they're calling, this ideology as the radical left or neoliberalism. I'm focusing on these two because they've been prominent figures in making their point very clear that they are against this anti-racism movement as an ideology. And just for your reference, if you're not familiar with them, Rufo has been talking to a lot of politicians in the States, and Lindsay has the website that I mentioned last time, and actually has a book called Cynical Theories. So again, we're talking about racism, we're talking about anti-racism, and then lastly, the third point that we're going to cover is why. Why is this conversation important? So on the one hand, and it's been visible just even in the YouTube comments here in my channel, that some people have felt that they've been victims to that kind of like cancel culture or that like mob culture. So this video series is definitely going to be for you. You also have the people that, respectfully, as much as I can say it, they parrot what they hear without necessarily understanding what they're saying. And that's for the ideology as much as it is against it. This video series also going to be for you. And then there's the people that just want to know more. You want to get maybe a different perspective or more insight to deepen your understanding. This video series is definitely going to be for you. So how are we going to talk about anti-racism if we haven't clearly defined what racism is? So this video summarizes really well, I argue, part of the reason why people struggle coming to terms with the word, right? We can't decide and we can't convince other people of which definition of racism we're working with. What's the result? People end up throwing around racism and racist, as my favorite expression goes, willy-nilly. So I'm going to give you a potentially uncomfortable question that I want you to consider. Can Black people be racist? Okay? I'm going to give you combined definitions of racism and different types of racism from this book. So it says racism involves the hierarchical and socially consequential valuation of racial groups. What does that mean? So that means that the perceived physical differences of people, like their skin color, what you see, are used to make different groups. Races, right? That's where that kind of like social construction of race comes from, right? Because you might not be perceived the same way. Like someone with my skin color might be perceived differently depending on where I am in parts of the world. Now, then some sort of attributions are given to those groups, right? This group's smart, not smart, hardworking, lazy, etc. Now, finally, racism then entails using those perceived differences like the skin color to either deny or exclude people from a particular category. So a particular race group, you're saying, nope, can't do this. Or perpetuate implicitly or explicitly a negative view, like a stereotype about specific groups. Now, why is this complicated? Well, when we consider the question, can Black people be racist, we need to consider at what level of racism we're talking about. First, there is the individual or everyday racism, right? So this is explicit behavior or words, and generally it's a little bit easier for us to understand, right? Using slurs, any form of hate crime, obvious stereotyping, those are very explicit acts of racism. What's a little bit harder to understand is implicit racism, like microaggressions, right? And these are probably harder to pick out or to even call out to understand, is because one, it's not really in your face, it's not explicit, and to be quite honest with you, and I'm also part of this category, a lot of us do it, right? We have aspects of implicit racism and we don't actually learn, for example, that it's a microaggression until we get called out on it. For example, let's say an East Asian person is being asked where they're from in North America. This is a microaggression. This is subtle discrimination and implicit racism on an individual level. And I know some people are like, no, it's not. Listen to me. Listen to me. It implies that the speaker held a view, some sort of stereotype about the perceived race of, the person they're interacting with. So in this case, the assumption is that the East Asian person equals immigrant, someone who either doesn't have a command of the English language or someone who is not part of, the norm relative to being a citizen. In this case, I know it might make you feel a little bit uncomfortable to think, but what would be considered the norm in North America? Being white. Hopefully you're with me so far. Now, for the following two types of racism, I'm going to read direct definitions again. I want you to keep in mind that this moves beyond the individual act of implicit or explicit behavior, and it involves power. It's going to be a little bit different. So institutional racism are the policies, practices, and procedures which may directly or indirectly, consciously or unwittingly promote, sustain, or entrench differential advantage or privilege for the peoples of certain races. Repeat that if you need. And it results in inequitable outcomes for different racialized groups. We're going to come back to that idea of inequitable outcomes. Now, systemic racism refers to the laws, the rules, and norms woven into the social system that result in an unequal distribution of economic, political, and social resources and rewards among various racial groups. Now, I'm gonna be completely honest with you. I somehow simultaneously understand and don't understand that. At the very least, to put it very nicely, there's definitely some follow-up questions that I had while I was reading that 20 times over. Institutional racism, you can think this as our universities or schools, institutions, buildings. They have policies that can sustain advantage, privilege for certain groups. Now, this is easy to understand in terms of logistics. Think about, school segregations in Canada, at least, in a not too far past, Black people could not attend the same schools as white people. So you can understand that the books, the literature, even the career paths that are talked about and taught in schools, all of that was woven into the public school curriculum without taking the Black community members into consideration, because originally it didn't serve them, It does make sense to me anyways that there can be a perpetuation of certain ideas, to say the least, which results in inequitable outcomes. But the question then becomes, what is an inequitable outcome? When I think about equity, I think about people in a race, and unfortunately, not everyone starts at that same point. I'm going to do it this way, right? Not everyone starts at the start line. There's a couple people that are further in front, a couple people that are probably further behind, right? Equity in this case means that the people that are further behind in the race are receiving support that can help them succeed, right? So it's kind of helping them catch up to the people that were in front. So when institutional racism means inequitable outcome, I take this to mean that not everyone is getting the support that they need, right? But the real question is, we need to be asking, how is this measured, right? How can we know whether outcomes become measurable? You get what I'm saying? Hopefully it'll be clearer in a second. The way I see it, we're either talking about implicit bias, right? That people hold and, somehow they have the ability to affect that racialized group because of that bias, the internal bias they have. Like, for example, their ability to get proper health care. And if we're not talking about implicit bias, we're probably talking about outcomes pertaining to jobs, for example. Now, in my previous Jordan Peterson analysis video, I spoke about implicit bias and including trainings and whatnot. So I'm not going to focus on that right now. I'm going to focus on that second point, which is pertaining to jobs. And actually, someone in the comment section of that Jordan Peterson video actually pointed out that Peterson in the past has spoken about equality of opportunity, which is basically where, you know, people get all the same chance for a job, instead of equality of outcomes. So that's where what this person called preferential hiring, to ensure that there's like X number of every single racial category in a particular field. Now, if you saw my comment, I argued that equality of opportunity is flawed. It doesn't take into consideration how institutions might be sustaining an unequitable status quo. It views everyone in that race as starting at the exact same point, and we know that's not the case. So I don't think it's that. But I also don't think that equality of outcome is what people are necessarily going for either. At least in this definition that I kind of read out to all of you. No one is expecting or necessarily saying that we need the exact same number of, let's say, female identifying plumbers as male identifying plumbers. I don't think anyone's saying that. Even Peterson actually brings up in a video that someone in the comment section posted for me to watch. In an egalitarian country where the citizens are supposedly viewed as like all equal regardless of the, you know, gender, orientation, age, blah, blah, blah. Even in those types of countries, you actually had very gender segregated jobs, which, by the way, I haven't actually found the study. So if anyone finds the study that Peterson was referring to, please let me know. But basically, Peterson was arguing, even when you give people freedom of choice, you have men tending to do this and you have women tending to do that. Backtracking a little bit, I asked, how can we measure inequitable outcome? Like, again, how do we know that we've succeeded? It's really important when we have these goals, when we're talking about equity and you know, diversity. My personal thinking is that we also need to look at systemic racism, which speaks to the laws in place within the social system. It's through here where we might be able to, statistically anyways, better understand and analyze the distribution of the economic, political, and social resources that are kind of spread amongst the different racial groups in a country. And actually, I think this is where critical race theory can come into play as a framework for understanding the relationship between race, racism, and power. And I know I critiqued James Lindsay in particular before, saying CRT equals anti-racism, and I still stand by it. They are not the exact same thing. But I am starting to understand better how someone like Christopher Rufo took the framework of critical race theory and made it into this like boogeyman that is popping up in schools everywhere in the USA and indoctrination and brainwashing the kids, blah, blah, blah. I do understand a little bit more of the connection now. By the way, as I mentioned before, I believe I definitely will be making a series on CRT. That is its own little train of learning, but we are going to start off with anti-racism first. Now, this topic and many others pertaining to social justice, it obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but it does get a lot of negative feedback, to put it nicely, because of its complexity. And I personally find that the most challenging aspect is there's no red pill, you know, like in the Matrix. There's no single way to understand something simply, easily, immediately, right? It's going to require a lot of probably getting uncomfortable, having brave conversations, and kind of putting yourself out there. So I would like to say thank you very much if you made it to the end of the video. If you learned something new in this video, please give it a thumbs up. If it gave you something else to look up, research, created wonderings, if it got you on a rabbit hole so you could prove me wrong in the comments, double thumbs up and give it a subscribe as well. I'll see the rest of you in the next video. Bye.